We appreciate everybody being here. And we got some visitors. We're thankful for that. And we're studying in the book of Joshua. I've got the handouts, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time seeing how a lot of the questions in the handouts has to do with busy work, and which means, you go through the passage and you find out the specific cities that are a part of individual tribes. And while that's well and good, and you have to do a little bit of reading and a little bit of digging to be able to do that, then there's some overriding principles that we want to deal with that I would determine would be a little bit more important than that. And so that's what we're going to be trying to do in our study this morning. And we will be looking at specific things, obviously, from the text and points that we can make that apply by principle to our day and age for sure. But before we get started, let's bow for a word of prayer, if you would. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the rest of the night and for this new, beautiful day that you've given us the opportunity to begin. We pray, Heavenly Father, that you would help us as we seek to remove from our minds the cares of the world and focus it upon those things that are spiritual in nature that prepare us for a home in heaven one day. May we always seek thy will in our lives and seek to do thy bidding in each and every situation we find ourselves in on a daily basis, that we might let our light shine as we follow in the footsteps of Jesus. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right. I have where I want to begin talking about here, and this is some of this material is maybe a little bit repetitive, but nonetheless I think it's pretty significant. For example, one of the things that we sort of just flew over when it came to the dividing of the land of Canaan, what were some of the different points that were made relative to the borders of the various territories? And was that something that still exists today when people are explaining the borders of their tract of land? Well, of course, the answer is yes. So what were some of those things? Rivers. Your property goes to the river. Now, believe it or not, even in the deeds that are recorded down here in Sequatchie County Courthouse, then you'll find property that is written down that individual's property goes to a river. Goes to a river, nonetheless. And it might border on the other side a mountain range or a particular point on a mountain range. For example, down through the years when I used to work with a surveyor, and of course John knows all this, he's written more plats than Dones has got pills, I guess. That used to be a statement. Of course, now people don't know what Dones pills is, but it was in olden times a very popular remedy for lower back pain, and so everybody took it, which means there was a whole lot of Dones pills. But in all of those writing of those various titles to land and the plats that would represent those pieces of property, then you would find, for example, a point on top of the Yellow Cliffs. Now that's up behind Mom and Dad's house up there in Mount Airy. We were involved in surveying a piece of property for Bill and Betty Staggs, in which it was determined that there had been some coal mining on their property, and whether it was intentional or not, never could determine that. But when it was determined that they were in fact mining coal off of their property, and another company was doing that, then in order to settle that matter, the mining company went bankrupt. So needless to say, all the work that we went in and engaged in and going from a point on top of the Yellow Cliffs, 3 miles, true lining all the way back behind Lusk, we got paid, but Bill and Betty didn't. They had to pay us. Now, we went through and painted a pretty yellow line on that piece of property, but obviously that's the way that property sometimes is divided, or distinction is made between two pieces of property because there's a river in between them. So that's what happened here. So it really shouldn't surprise us that same old type of way of defining people's property and people's possessions are the same today as they were then. And of course, you get into problems as well when you have maybe a extra amount of water and the river overflows and it makes a new pathway to travel, and then all of a sudden, if you take it per the a specific point on the river, then you end up getting a whole lot more property, and the person that you're next to doesn't have anything left, so you got to make provisions for that from time to time. But here, from the Jordan River all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, you can't hardly miss that, because there's the Jordan River, and then the Mediterranean Sea is not going to go anywhere. It's going to stay there. And so 3 tribes stacked on top of each other possess that property so they can know what land they're responsible to. And it's not just a matter of them being able to say, this is our land. What added responsibility do they have? They had the responsibility to protect it and actually make it their land, solely theirs. Which means what? Anybody else has got to be gone. They've got to go quietly, or they got to go by force. It's one or the other. And of course, while at the beginning of this, and this, I don't know why it was so difficult for them to see what was involved here and what God intended as He instructed them to do this, because it would simply, because God didn't just say do that, He told them what would happen if they didn't do that. So He's not only giving them a specific command as to do not allow the heathens to stay in your property. He says if you do allow the heathens to stay in your property, then you're going to regret it ultimately. And guess what? It happened just like God said it would. Now we're going to see some specific things that are said relative to some of those tribes and the choices they made in our study here. But it's always going to be the case. I mean, if God had just said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to exterminate the heathen in the land. If they don't leave on their own, then you force them out. If they fight you, wipe them out. That's all He had to say. But then He goes a step further and says, if you don't, here's what's going to happen. Not only will you be disobedient to me, but then all the consequences that are going to come your way by disobeying me will make you wish you had paid attention to what I said to begin with. And the Bible's filled with examples of that. It's not something that's stuck in every now and then in an obscure way, and you sort of pick up and say, well, that's strange. No, that's the way it always is when God gives instructions like that, He specifically, most of the time, tells you why it will go bad for you if you don't do what He tells you to do. And certainly that is the case here for sure. And then we're made aware of a fellow who's certainly a hero during this period of time. Beginning in chapter 14, we are looking at an individual who's obviously head and shoulders above the rest of many Old Testament people. What's his name? One of the only other fellow of that generation that got to go in the land of Canaan? Caleb. Good old Caleb. Now what's interesting about Caleb is that due to the amount of time that has passed, he's now properly classified as an old man. So surely an old man like that would not be expected to be on the top of his game nor possess the ability that he could have accomplished, 40, 50 years earlier. But that's simply not the case at all with Caleb. Because Caleb considers himself to be well capable of being faithful to God with whatever ability he still possesses. Now, when he makes a statement, what is the statement that he makes that is sort of maybe hard for us to swallow as being really accurate?
Strong as I was when I was with Moses.
All right, he says, I'm as strong now as I was when I was sent out by Moses to spy out the land. Now, wait a minute. That's 38 years earlier. And actually, that's 38 years plus the 7 years that they've been fighting. So that's 38 plus 7 that's 45 years ago. So he's as strong now physically as he was back then? Or does the concept of strength not necessarily take into account or demand that it be physical strength? Now, he may be that strong in his mind. I know some guys who think they're as strong now as they were 45 years ago. course, they're lying to themselves, but they think they are. And I've seen some that tried to prove it, and then they ended up in a hospital because they broke the rack, or whatever. Or tried to jump over something they could 45 years ago, or tried to whoop somebody they could have whooped 45 years ago, but certainly not now, or tried to lift as much weight as they lifted 45 years ago, but they could. So how do we explain the statement that's made here by Caleb? What did he possess that was at the same level now as it was way back then? Faith in God. Confidence that God would do what he promised to do. And so while, and of course you can reason into it as well that, and this is something that young people don't understand because they've not lived through it yet, but one of these days they will. Sometimes it's not brute strength that makes it possible to be successful in a battle. It's wisdom that surrounds your absence of brute strength that causes you to be successful. And the wisdom and the strength and the spiritual maturity that comes from determining to follow God all these years would place them in a very powerful position, because he's not only older now, and his physical abilities may not be at the peak that they were at one time. His wisdom is more so now than it was way back then. The older that you get, the wiser you're supposed to be getting. And that's not always the way it works, but that's the design that God created us with, so that when our fleshly bodies are getting weaker, our spiritual selves are getting stronger. And that's exactly right. That's why you find a terminology that designates the age of individuals who are serving as overseers of congregation. They are, due to the fact that they've been around a long time, are in a position where they're supposed to be wiser and can make determinations that are not just available for somebody who's a novice or someone who's not been involved in things as much as one who's older has been. And of course, you can't really appreciate that until you've gone through it and experienced the maturity and the growth that comes. I had a fella not too long ago. He asked me, he said, "Have you not ever changed your mind on anything?" I said, "Yeah, but I went from being wrong to right, not right to wrong. What you're doing, there's a difference. Changing your mind is always available. When you find out you're wrong, then you admit you're wrong, and now you start doing what's right. But to change your mind for another reason, just to fit in or to not rub people the wrong way or this whatever, then that's not maturing. That, as a matter of fact, that would be going in reverse of maturity. And of course, it's a never-ending process where it doesn't matter how mature, spiritually speaking, one becomes, it can always become more spiritually mature. And we have the perfect example of Jesus, who we are constantly striving to be more like and closer to, because he's the perfect example of what spiritual maturity, in fact, is, for sure. So here's old Caleb. And what tribe was Caleb from, by the way? He was from the tribe of Judah. And so when you see the dividing of the land in the back of the handouts there, then you can see where all of these, because here was Judah. I mean, and this is something that's not just said just flat out in so many words, but you can draw the conclusion about this from the terms that are used and the attitudes that are possessed by the various tribes. Overall, Judah considered themselves to be the big dog, okay? But at the same time, Manasseh and Ephraim considered themselves to be the very best, the cream of the crop. And of course, from a physical standpoint, then neither one of them should have been viewed as the cream of the crop more than any others. But from the standpoint of having more people, then certainly Judah and Manasseh did have more people. You know, does more people always equate to more strength? Well, no, not necessarily. You know, but they had that attitude towards themselves, which comes out, and even at some points in time in the Old Testament, God will refer to the nation as Ephraim, because they wanted to be first and foremost. And so when he's letting them, the whole nation, have it for their ungodliness, he says Ephraim is a cake unturned. Well, that's not just talking about the tribe of Ephraim. That's collectively the whole nation is pictured as being Ephraim. You want to be the main guy? Okay, you're the main problem then. You're the main guy and you're the main problem too, is the way that he would express that. In verse chapter, we're still in chapter 14. Who are the three individuals that are involved in the dividing of the land? It's been that way since all the way back before, but now as it comes down to the final 7 tribes and their allotment, who are the individuals that are involved? Of course, Joshua and Eliezer, who's a what? He's a high priest, okay, and then the heads of the families, okay. So you got these threefold representatives. So from a practical standpoint, again, you know, if the heads of the families had not been actively involved in this, then there could have been said, well, wait a minute, there wasn't anybody there to speak up for us. There wasn't anybody there to say, hey, I need more further instruction on it. Well, they couldn't say that because they were actively involved in the dividing of the land. And thus it was divided as God intended to by lot, remember. Let's jump ahead to chapter number 16. Chapter number 16, where Joseph's children are mentioned. And of course, Joseph's children were Ephraim and Manasseh. We know that a half tribe of Manasseh had situated themselves on the eastern side of the Jordan River, so that leaves the half tribe of Manasseh over on the western side of the Jordan River, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, or the Great Sea, sometimes it's referred to as. But how successful was Ephraim in being able to take over their territory? In verse 10. They didn't drive out the inhabitants. Now, that's a prevailing theme, sadly. And instead of driving them out, what did they do? They
forced them to work.
All right, they forced them to work. They let them live. And they got what from them? Taxes or tribute. Okay? Now, this, of course, is this something God said, well, that'll be all right? You know, yeah, sure. You know, I mean, I've told you to drive the inhabitants out of the land, and I'm going to be with you as you are. But if you get tired of fighting, and you'd rather not get involved in any more bloodshed or anything like that, and you have a kind of benevolent heart to some, and you want them to just stay in the land and let them live amongst you, and maybe put them to work, but also you get taxes from them, money coming in, and you don't have to do any fighting, then that'll be all right. No, that won't be all right. But yet their mentality was, here's great opportunity for us. We don't have to get our hands dirty, and we're going to have money coming in. What better arrangement could there be than that? Well, the problem was, that's not what God said to do. They're not supposed to be able to be bought off. I mean, just think if it had been the case, if the attitude that was possessed by the Canaanites as the children of Israel are making their way that way, and of course from the words of Rahab saying, we're scared to death. We know what God's done with you all this time. What if they'd have said, hey, can we just stay here and give you some money? Well, I dare say there's a lot of those city-states which said, you know, it's better to pay them a big old tax than to be dead, so let's just do that. And so we got all these heathens more heathens living in the land of Canaan than children of Israel. And then their destruction would have come sooner because their influence of the heathen would have been more severe at an earlier point in time. And then they could have gone into captivity a whole lot earlier than they ended up going into captivity because of the end result of these foolish decisions they're making back here. No, there's no way to rationally, reasonably, and logically get around doing what God said to do. It might have sounded good to them, but the way of man is not in himself. There's a way that seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. The way we look at things should be the way God looks at things, instead of vice versa. You know, well, I don't see anything wrong with that. Well, it's not really up to you or me to be the standard that determines what's right and wrong. God does that. And it's our responsibility to recognize the standard that God has given. We're going to talk about that from a moral standpoint in the sermon today. And while that is, I don't think anybody could possibly deny it, and yet there are people who do. Irrationally for sure, but they deny it nonetheless. And so here's a classic example. So it really shouldn't surprise us that when that happens with one tribe, then other tribes would follow the lead of this money access by not doing what God said do. Let's just not worry about doing what God says do, and let's just put them to tribute. Well, I know we're jumping over a bunch of stuff, but that's... Now, notice what it said concerning Manasseh. Here's the other son. In chapter 17, 12, and 13. What did they decide to do as it relates to this allotment of land that they were given? They didn't run out the heathen either, did it? But they followed the example that had been set. Reckon how many of these people started thinking like this, or was just a part of the mental makeup of people. Well, we know that's what God said do, but that's we're tired of fighting. We've been fighting for over 7 years, and here we are still fighting. Be a whole lot easier if we just didn't have to fight anymore, and we'll have money coming in too. Look at them; they're not that bad of people if you get to know them. Oh, sure, they worship false idols, and engage in all type of licentious activity in their worship. But deep down, they're just human beings like the rest of us. Just let them stay here. We need to be kind. Isn't God a loving God? Yeah, and that's why he said, get them out of your midst. It's because he loves them. And he doesn't want them to be adversely affected by the heathen. Yeah, it's so clear from the beginning to the end of God's revelation. Why is it so hard for people to see that? It don't make any sense to me. And when I say it don't make any sense, it doesn't follow a line of rationality that would lead anyone to conclude that this is the right thing to do. It's the very opposite. If you use your mind... Oh, it's a whole lot easier. Yeah. You go all the way back to the very first sin. Here this fruit to Eve looked like it would really taste good. And probably did. And the added benefit, not only it looked pretty and it tasted pretty, but it would make them wise like God. Well, who could hold Eve responsible for violating God's will? Well, God could. Because he said, don't do it. Don't do it. And so here you've got the classic example of God saying one thing and the devil saying the opposite thing, and humanity listens to the devil instead of God. And that is history right there in a nutshell. That's what happens all the time. if you do this, here's the consequence. You're going to die physically. You're going to begin to die physically. You're going to die spiritually because you've sinned and eaten of the forbidden fruit. Give it to your husband. He ate it. And then, of course, as is the case with both of them, they begin to make excuses. You know, this woman, God, you gave me this woman. This woman lied to me. She deceived me into believing that I ought to take her, and I did. And of course, Eve says, that sneaky snake, well, he is so deceptive. He just hoodwinked me. I couldn't help it. No. She looked, she lusted, she coveted after it, she ate it. Same poor old David. I mean, all he is minding his business, looking out the window, and there's a woman, beautiful woman, taking a bath. I couldn't help it. I could not. I just looked out the window. Well, when you looked out the window, did you keep on looking out the window? Did something grab a hold of your head and make you keep on looking out the window? Or did you just choose to look out the window and then lead to adultery and lead to the death of the child and lead to the death of the husband of the woman that you had an adulterous affair with? That's what happened. Was that within the realm of ability to stop that at any point in time? Sure. Would that have been the easy thing to do? No. But when there's a choice between the easy and the right, we got to do the right instead of the easy. Okay. So when you're talking about, always keep this in mind when you're talking about the taking of the promised land, it never was followed through on as God intended. Never was. And because of that, then you end up with the book of Judges, which is a catastrophic explanation as to the results when you don't do what God tells you to do. You end up with all types of problems and suffer the consequences of that for sure.
Well, because they didn't annihilate and push them out of the way. And basically they followed the rest of the time.
Yeah. It's almost like if you've got a disease that you can get rid of if you use the prescription, you know. We're not talking about something that doesn't have a cure, you know. But if you don't use the means whereby you can be cured, then you're going to suffer from it from then on. And it's your own fault. And so here, that's what happens. They keep on having to deal with these people who are right there in their midst. And then, of course, the barrier and the maybe possible animosity that should have existed there because of the ungodliness of those people, then when you end up intermarrying with them and having joint business ventures with them, then it's very difficult for you to look upon them as being your enemies who are out to destroy you spiritually. But yet that's exactly what they are. Their allegiance is not to the God that the Israelites serve. Their allegiance is to another God or no God. And that simply is not a fellowship or a companionship or a communion that can last. It can't, just don't work that way. What concord, what communion, what fellowship has light with darkness? None. Zip. Doesn't have it. What harmony, what concord, what community, spirit and attitude and action exists between heathenism and righteousness? None. None. And that should be clear, but sadly, it's not as clear as it ought to be. So Ephraim and Manasseh were both unsuccessful, and the problem with each one of those or any other time that happens is in actuality, they lacked what? Faith. They lacked faith. Now, how could you say they lacked faith? Well, I mean, how would you reason to the conclusion that you would say it was an absence of faith on their part? They didn't do what God told them to do. And the thing, it was not a matter of them not understanding what God told them to do. It was a matter of them not believing what God told them to do to the extent that they would do what God told them to do. You call that faithlessness. And of course, that's exactly why all the parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles of all these people who are now going into the land of Canaan, that's exactly the reason why they wandered in the wilderness until they died. It's because they did not trust God to follow through on what He'd promised to do. Will God keep His promises? I mean, is there a more basic question than that? No, there's not. If God keeps His promises because He's God, and He always keeps His promises, then when I fail to do His bidding, then I don't trust God. I don't have any confidence in God. And should God be concerned about propping me up if I question His ability? If I take into question His capability of following through on what He's promised to do? You know? So the lesson of history is we don't learn from history. You know? That's the one thing we learn from history, is that we don't learn from history, sadly. By the way, what tribe was Joshua from? He was from Ephraim, okay? And, of course, that's a point that's made that you sort of need to have in mind when you're talking to a premillennialist who will contend from passages like Revelation chapter 7, verse 4 through 9, when the tribes are listed from which people are saved eternally, and it just so happens that the tribe of Ephraim is not mentioned. So, according to premillennialism, then Joshua misses out on eternity and bliss. Amazingly. Of course, that just another little side point to show the fallacy of premillennialism for sure. And then when we get to chapter 20, I know we're hurrying over this, but on chapter 20, we have introduced something that has served as a basis for sermons that I preach for sure, and it has to do with 6 cities that are referred to as what? Cities of refuge. Cities of refuge. And as it relates to these cities of refuge, then one of the things that's sort of hard for us to wrap our head around is how that there was such a tremendous amount of obligation that was placed on the shoulders of the next of kin when somebody's life was taken. Even to the degree, and of course keep in mind, they didn't have a lawyer on every corner. You know, you didn't have advertisements on television, call this number and we'll take care of you. No, they didn't have all that. And so if a person was killed, and it didn't matter what it was that caused their death, the avenger of blood, or the next of kin, was to try to hunt that person down and take his life. Okay? And so the erection of these 6 cities of refuge were situated 3 on the eastern side of the Jordan River and 3 on the western side of the Jordan River, and they were spread out where anybody could get to any one of those cities in less than a day. And when they get to that city, they would plead their case. They'd say, listen, this was an accident. I was plowing, and my mule took off running and plowed this fella right into the ground, and it killed him. But, I mean, it was an accident. Now, the person who is trying to avenge the blood of this guy who has actually been killed, he don't need to know all that. He's not even given the responsibility of knowing all that. That's supposed to be figured out when he makes his way to one of these cities of refuge, in which then he is actually given refuge from the avenger of blood. And they'll make a determination then as to whether this was a out-and-out first-degree murder, a case, or it was accidental, or there were extenuating circumstances in it. And somebody says, well, that's a very primitive way to take care of situations like, well, I agree with that too, you know. But primitive is certainly what they're having to deal with, since how they did not have the wonderful judicial system, joke, that we have in our country today. You know.
Well, ours is similar in a sense, because what we do, we put them in jail. That protects them.
Yeah, that protects them, sure.
Protects them from being injured.
Yeah.
And then we go to court.
And then we go and establish whether it was first-degree murder, second-degree, third-degree, manslaughter, all these different levels of obligation and responsibility. And of course, keeping in mind, too, that even as it related to if you had an animal that was known to be mean and hurt people, and you did not properly restrain that animal, then you could be held guilty of the death of a person if you had not been taking care of that animal and keeping it from being able to kill a person. Now, are there laws like that today on the books? Well, sure there is. You know, if a person has a dog that is known to kill anything it can get its hands on, or its mouth on, then if you do not protect society from that animal, then you can be held responsible for the damage done by that animal. You know, and that's only proper. The point, of course, in the law of Moses is not in regards to a dog like that, but to an ox that gores people. You know, a hot-tempered ox that can kill a man, and you know that he can. And then see, some of these things you have to set up and put all your evidence together, because here you've got this animal that you know that if he's let loose, then he'll kill somebody. And then all of a sudden you find out that here's a guy that you don't like, and so you trick him into getting in the pen where this animal's at, and then it kills him. Even though it's in the pen, then you can still be held responsible if the truth is established as to your guilt of the matter, for sure. So when they would make it to these cities of refuge, then they'd present themselves before the authorities of the city, and they'd make a determination. And if it was the case, and here's the way the law worked, that as long as you were in that city, it didn't matter if the avenger of blood was right outside the city, he was protected from any harm coming to it by those citizens in the city. If he was guilty of first-degree murder, he was turned out. But if it was an accidental thing, then he stayed there. And again, I don't know why this is the specifics of it, but how long did he have to stay there? Till the death of the high priest. So, if you were going to be involved accidentally in the taking of a human life, you would hope that the high priest was old, you know, or else you might be having to stay in the city a long, long time. But that was one of the provisions. And then, legally, you could leave that city and go back home and take up life as it had existed before, because you were not guilty of premeditated murder. It was actually an accident. And that made sense for the situation they found themselves. Now, here's the point. Are there instances throughout the Old and New Testament as well that refer to God as being our refuge? So in the same type of way, see, we can flee to Christ, who provides us with refuge through his blood, so that we are not sitting ducks for the avenger of blood from a spiritual standpoint. So the figures and the comparisons are beautiful to behold if we understand that significance. You know, all the way back in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, whosoever sheds man's blood shall by a man have his blood shed. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying what? Capital punishment is in effect. Did God's attitude towards capital punishment change in the Mosaic era? Nope. Did it change in the Christian era? Nope. Still intact. Still intact. And of course, there's two classic examples that illustrates that to be the case in the New Testament. When Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate said, as Jesus wasn't talking to him like Pontius Pilate wanted him to, and he said, don't you know, Pilate said to Jesus, don't you know I have the power to execute you and I have the power to turn you loose? And Jesus said, in essence, yep, you've got that power. But the only reason why you've got that power is because my Father in heaven gave you that power, but you do have the power to kill me, execute me. And you have the power to turn me loose. So if Pilate had the power to carry out capital punishment, then capital punishment is still authorized to be carried out. And then the next example, of course, is Paul, who had the audacity to make this statement in his defense: if I have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. Now, what is directly implied in that statement? There are some things that a person can do that warrant the death penalty. And Paul said, if I'm guilty of something like that, then away with me. Now, the only problem is I'm not guilty of anything like that, so you're treating me like a common criminal and a murderer when I hadn't done anything deserving of the death penalty. But there are some things that are deserving of the death penalty. Now, does that mean that a person on death row cannot be saved? Well, of course not. It means that the consequences for some crimes is so severe that not only does a person forfeit their right to freedom, they forfeit their right by divine decree to live. And if that law was followed more so, we wouldn't have so much of the mess that we have today in violation of God's law. Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm supposed to.
And now you put somebody in the lock them up. I saw a case the other day where she kept this woman locked up 5 years. And then she fled out and wound up, she murdered. She fled out to murder that she had done it. So they give her the benefit of time served 5 years. And then when they work the rest, she's going to be able to spend about another year and a half. She's got about 6.5 years.
For murder. You know, I mean, is that a deterrent? You know, when you think about 6 years, you just about, as a young person, you could stand on your head for 6 years. Yes, sir, Ian.
Well, I think it's interesting in Romans chapter 13 and verse 3 and 4, it kind of builds on the point that rulers are only in existence to be God's servant and to carry out the will of God. Our government system has thrown that away because to follow God's law, you have to execute. It says in verse 4, you have to wield the sword, not in vain.
Yep.
You have to avenge people who have been killed or things done to them that isn't supposed to happen. And so that's a failure on our government system. It's why eventually all government systems that go away from God will eventually fall because they don't have a moral backbone.
Exactly. And they don't have a consistent justice standard to rely upon. The only thing worse than justice not being executed speedily is justice not being served equally. You know? And when you put those two together, then you've got our country today, sadly. And of course, there is a remedy to it. It's going back, the sword in vain is not a reference to rehabilitation. The sword is a reference to the extermination of the guilty party in a capital crime. Well,
You know, we're at a point in time where most countries in the world have always been like that. Okay?
yeah,
We're at a point in time though where we're headed in that direction, but we still recognize it for the most part.
yeah,
For the most part. Whether we can do anything about it is up.
yeah, that's the thing. Recognizing the need to fix it and being able to fix it is two different things. Like the example we give, people hire some person to come into a company and find out everything that's wrong, and then somebody else comes in and fixes it. Well, I'd rather have that first job. The second job, how are we going to fix all this? Whoa, that's going to be harder. So that's, and that'll always be the case.